Fridays are our cleaning day, so that's coming up really quickly too. My kids love all of those chores. Of course, I'm being sarcastic there. When I think about trash night, and here's where I'm going with this. None of my kids want to take the trash out, right? None of my kids want to wash the dishes either. But if I were to offer them $5 to take the trash out, they would be all over it. They would fight over who got to take the trash out, just like they would fight over who didn't have to take the trash out on a normal night. And so, as a parent, I've struggled with this. Like, do I pay my kids to do chores or do I not pay them? And I've erred on the side of I'm not going to pay my kids to do chores because I want them to want to help out around the house, right? And I've based that philosophy, and I have the same philosophy in the classroom. I've based that philosophy on the work of Daniel Pink. If you haven't read Daniel Pink's book on Drive, I really encourage you to go out and read this book. It's a fantastic book that applies to a lot of things in life, but certainly as educators, we can learn a whole lot from Daniel Pink and his research on human motivation. Because there's a lot of surprising things that he reveals inside of that research. And I don't think that you'll be surprised, though, to really know that it all boils down to extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation. When we think of extrinsic motivation, I always think of like carrots and sticks, and Daniel Pink talks about that in his book, right? A carrot and stick would be if I were to put a $5 bill on the table, and tell my kids, if you take the trash out, I'll pay you this money. That would be a carrot and stick. What Daniel Pink found out is that only works for a little bit, right? Because here's what'll happen. And I will fess up here. I pay my son to help me mow the lawn, right? And so he's been doing it for a couple of years. We have a pretty big yard, and so I mow part of it, and he mows part of it. And this year, guess what? He won't do it for the same price that I paid him last year. He thinks it's time for a raise. So extrinsic motivation only works to a certain extent. And what Daniel Pink uncovered is that we really need that intrinsic motivation. We really need to motivate from within. And so I think it's the same when we're talking in the classroom, that we have to find ways to motivate our students beyond, we're going to give you a grade on this, right? Or beyond, do it because I want you to do it. Okay, that's one thing that my kids hate too, do it because I said so. Okay, for those of you that haven't been with us the last couple of weeks, my name is Jason Luebke. I'm a global solution specialist for Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. I primarily serve Latin America. I spend a lot of time in Mexico, although not very much recently, of course. So my contact information is there. Feel free to reach out to me and continue the conversation after we're done today. I'm also on WhatsApp, so feel free to reach out that way. And like we said, today we're going to talk all about learner engagement and how we get our students to be interested in and do the things that we want them to in the classroom. And the reality is that just because we want them to do those things doesn't mean that they will, right? We have to develop inside of them that need, that desire to want to learn and want to engage in the projects and the resources that we're putting in front of them. And so as I was developing this today, I really kind of struggled with how do I tailor this specifically for online instruction, right? And I'll be really honest, about 15 minutes before we started, I deleted the words for online instruction on my title slide. And here's why. Because I don't know that it's all that much different. When we're doing virtual instruction, and for the last couple of weeks, we've been focusing a lot on what are the tools and resources, and what does it look like when we take our traditional instruction and move it virtual. And the reality is simple. It's when it comes to learner engagement, it's really all about that intrinsic motivation. And I don't know that that's a whole lot different when we think about virtual instruction. Okay, so I'm gonna approach this just from an instructional standpoint and engaging students. And as we go along, we can talk about or think about how we might make that look virtually as well. All right. So I've got sort of three topics we're going to talk about today. We're going to start with why engagement is so important. All right. And I think that all of us know that student engagement is important, but sometimes it helps to really think about what is the data out there? What does the research say about why that's so important? And I'm just going to start with this, and I'm gonna come back to this topic specifically a little bit more as we go. This is from a book called Moving Beyond Quadrant A, and we're going to talk about these quadrants here in a little bit in a little more detail. But here's what Bernadette says: as the world gets more complex, fast-paced, and globalized, jobs will increasingly rely on strong collaboration skills. And I think we know that that's true, right? I've had multiple careers. I've got family members that have all sorts of different careers, and I've never come across anybody that says that collaboration is not important in the job that they're doing. And I think it's even more important in the 21st century and with the globalized society that we have, right? There's a statistic that I think kind of helps back that up a little bit, and that is this: 65% of jobs available in 2030 haven't even been created yet. You really think about that. That's 2/3 of jobs that are available to this year's class of second graders. And I know that because my daughter's in second grade, that 8-year-old that you saw taking the trash out for me earlier tonight. 65% or 2/3 of the jobs that will be available to her when she graduates high school have not been created yet. So we really, in education, have to get over this idea of just teaching topics and preparing students for specific careers. And we really need to focus on equipping students with the skills that are necessary to be successful in the globalized world, right? And that's what it's really all about. And so when we're thinking about learner engagement, I think it's critically important to be thinking about those things. Okay, so we're gonna move into part two here, talking about what it is that we need to look for in our students. And so I did a little bit of digging here and tried to look at what the research says about what our students should be responding and what it should look like in our classrooms, both brick and mortar classrooms, but also virtual classrooms, to know that our students are engaged. Okay, and I want to throw another quote at you. And Philip Schlechte is a researcher on learner engagement, and he says those students that are engaged learn at high levels, they have a profound grasp of what they learn, they retain it better, and they can transfer it to new contexts. And that's really important too, isn't it? Because again, we so often worry about, will the students remember this when they need to apply it to the next thing? And that's really what engagement is about, is teaching to that deep level so that not only do they retain it, but then they're able to transfer that to a new context. Okay, so I've got 4 points here. First of all, we know students are engaged, and I think this one speaks for itself. I think this is pretty obvious when they're attentive, right? Those students that are on task and they're paying attention to what work needs to be done, those are the students that we know are engaged. Students that are committed. And I really like this one because it goes back to that whole idea of extrinsic rewards or negative consequences. Those students that are committed, they don't need that reward. Okay. And I just want to give you the example of training a dog. So we've got our dog here in our house, and he's about 2 years old. And he's having some behavior problems. I'll be honest, I think that we could attribute it to everybody's home and he's just flat out annoyed. But we've been talking about how we train our dog to behave better. And so my kids, they're interested in this because they don't want us to, I don't know, give the dog away to somebody. And so they've been doing some research, and they found out that, right, when we yell at the dog, that's a negative consequence. That doesn't make the dog committed to being better. Right? When we only rely on the use of treats, that doesn't make him committed. He just wants to look for that treat, and he's always going to want another one, right? So it's about how do we ingrain that behavior? How do we get him committed to behaving the way that we want him to. Okay. Persistent. So this is the student that will stick with a task, right? Those students that when they come to something that's difficult, right, they want to overcome that difficulty. They want to stick with it. Inside of some of our newest programs at HMH, into reading, into literature, into math, we spend a lot of time talking about learning mindset and having that persistence. When the task gets hard, what do we do to overcome that task? So we're looking for students who are willing to do that and stick with it. You know, as soon as they come to something difficult, they don't have to rely on you as the teacher. They're willing to try to figure it out. And then, of course, meaning. Students will be engaged when they find meaning and value in the tasks that we put in front of them. Okay. So just in summary, what are we looking for inside of our students? We want students that are attentive, students that are committed, students that are persistent. They don't give up easily, and students who find meaning and value in the work that's in front of them. Let's get into then how we get to this. All right, so this is what we're looking for. This is sort of beginning with the end in mind. How do we get there, right? How do we engage our students? So this is the meat of what we're going to talk about tonight. First thing that we'll talk about is how we make it rigorous. Students, remember, we're trying to get to that point of persistence where they'll stick to a task. And so we need to make tasks rigorous in order to get to a point where they can be persistent. If we only put easy things in front of them, we'll never have an opportunity for them to demonstrate that persistence to us. So to talk about that, how we make it rigorous, from Bernadette Lambert in the book Moving Beyond Quadrant A, another great read, by the way. Inside of that book, we talk about the rigor and relevance framework. And here's what it is. So on the left-hand side, you see that y-axis going up, and you see where it says knowledge taxonomy. Think of this as Bloom's taxonomy. We go from that very low knowledge taxonomy, remembering, understanding, that's the acquisition of knowledge, and we move up to this point of creating, right? We're moving through analyzing and evaluating, okay? That's Bloom's taxonomy. That's the rigor axis. As we look across the bottom, we see the application model, okay? That's the relevance portion of the framework. See, I told you my dog wasn't very well behaved. Somebody knocked on the door. Hang on one second. Okay, guys, I apologize. The neighbor girl came over, wanted to know if my daughter could go on a bike ride. So, and I'm the only one home. Okay. Everybody can still see my screen, right?
Yes, I can.
Yes. Good. Okay. I apologize for that interruption. Okay, so we're going to talk about the bottom portion of this quadrant in a little bit, okay? But I want to really focus on the rigor part of the framework. And by the way, so you see that this is broken into A, B, C, and D. Okay, acquisition, application, assimilation, adaptation. When we talk about the rigor and relevance framework, what we really want is for our learning to fall in quadrant D. So we talk about quad D learning. All right, and we could get really deep into this. I'm just going to try to scratch the surface a little bit today. Quad A learning is where we're just introducing a topic, okay, and it's that acquisition of knowledge. And by the way, learning is going to fall everywhere in this quadrant, right? We're going to see lots of different learning fall into different parts of these four quadrants. But the real learning and the learning that will stick will happen when we get to quadrant D. And so I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later on. But first, I want to talk about how we raise the level of rigor inside of our lessons. Okay, how do we make it rigorous? So I really like putting these words with things so that you kind of get, you can start to think about how we apply that to the lessons that we have. Okay, we talked about students having persistence. In order to get there, it needs to be challenging tasks in front of them, challenging tasks that are demanding and difficult. We all want things that are mentally stimulating, right? And so if it's rigorous, it's got to have that mental stimulation involved as well, and things that require effort. And think about this too in a virtual setting. Okay, so we've got this picture here of a non-socially distanced science lab where our students have hands-on the learning. Okay, so we've got to think about how we can still take labs and make them virtual. You know, if you're thinking about that in a science classroom, we've got a great program, Science Dimensions, where we've got virtual labs, right? We can do that in a socially distant setting. Okay, so it doesn't have to be hands-on and together. Those things can happen virtually through our virtual platforms and some of the tools that we've talked about previously. Okay, when we talk about rigor, that means that we're trying to design lessons that move up that scale of Bloom's taxonomy, right? Going just from that acquisition of knowledge, the remembering and understanding, up that scale. Some action words to be thinking about when you're phrasing questions for your students and putting tasks in front of them. These are some really great words that will help you raise the rigor of your lessons. When we ask students to produce something, or maybe classify objects, right? Prioritize or create, decide, scrutinize. These are things that are going to raise that level of rigor and go beyond just that acquisition of knowledge. And what I like about these words is that you really can use them at any grade level, right? As long as those students can understand that word and you can define it for them and give them some guidance with that. But we can do that at all across the board to raise that level of rigor. Okay. Oftentimes when I talk with teachers and we start trying to decide what's rigorous and what's not, there's some misconceptions there. Okay. So let's look at the right-hand column here first. What is not rigorous? Well, just giving more or harder assignments is not rigorous. Okay. Difficult is, but just harder in general is not necessarily rigorous, right? Just giving students advanced placement or honors courses or IB courses does not necessarily mean that that is rigorous, right? It's about the work that we do inside of those courses. Just giving a student a higher level reading book or more homework does not automatically make that rigorous, okay? What is rigorous then? Let's look at that left-hand side. When we have to scaffold the thinking, what I mean by that is that we have to build up to it, right? Planning for thinking. So putting those questions in, like we talked about on the previous slide, so that we plan for students to have to think and not just come right to the answer, okay? Assessing thinking about content, that's a difficult thing to have to assess thinking. We have to think about what are the ways that we can assess that, how much or what kind of thinking process that the students went through. All right, managing the teaching and learning level for the desired thinking level. So just all of these under the rigor is all about thinking and getting our students to do the thinking, not just us as the teachers, right? So some more ways to increase the rigor in your lessons, and again, be thinking about how you would do this virtually, whether that's posing a questions and asking your students to respond in the chat while you're doing a video call, okay? Or perhaps it's sending out those questions to them in advance, right? And asking them to answer those. Share clear examples so they see what it looks like and then they can follow that and come up with their own process. We talked about measuring thinking. How do we do that? Well, we have to get students to write or speak to us so that we can see what that process that they're going through around their thinking really is. Okay, so getting students to write and speak about that. And of course, creating challenging problems, right? Okay, so that's rigor. We're going to jump into how we make it real for students. Okay, so we have to make it rigorous to make it engaging. We also have to make it real or relevant. So I'm going to go back now to that rigor relevance framework, right? We talked about Bloom's taxonomy on that vertical axis. Let's talk about that horizontal axis now. Call that the relevance axis or the application. Okay, so how does that work? Well, when we think about relevance, we're thinking about making it something that's significant to the students, making it something that's important to them, all right, that has impact on them in some way, worth or value, okay? We have to be able to make it personal, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later as well, all right? Just like we talked about moving up the scale of the rigor, we talk about moving across what I like to call the bridge to relevance, okay? So when I'm thinking about this, if I have knowledge in one discipline, okay, so I'm imparting knowledge about science, something related to science to my students, that's just in one discipline, okay, it won't really be all that relevant to them. When I ask them to take that knowledge and in some way apply it to their discipline, so take something that we know about cells and apply it inside of biology class, okay, that gets a little bit more relevant. But when I can take something that I know, let's say about math and solving problems, and I can apply that in science class, now I'm really starting to move across that bridge to relevance, okay? And what becomes more difficult for us as teachers, but more relevant when we put it in front of the students, is when we can take that learning and we can make it real. We can make it real world, okay? So when we're able to apply that to a real world predictable situation, that makes it even more relevant. And what's super relevant to kids and students is when we can make it apply to a real world unpredictable situation. Think COVID-19, right? That's a real world unpredictable situation. And how could we maybe tie learning into something like that, all right? And how we solve problems. Okay, just a little bit more on relevance. The reason that I'm pairing rigor and relevance together is because they really do rely on each other, all right? As we begin to move across that bridge to relevance, it makes rigor a lot easier and it makes it possible, right? All students respond well to relevant and contextual learning, okay? Remember that relevance is based on all of these things that you see here in this middle circle, okay? Their life, their family, their community, the real world. Current events is always a perfect topic to bring in to make things more relevant. And of course, their interest and talent. So when I think about working with my students, I try to find out what they're interested in. You know, are they big fans of, we call it soccer in America, but football, right? And if so, how can I bring football into my math classroom, right? Or science? How can we talk about maybe the trajectory of the ball or whatever it is, right? How do we bring in their interests or even their talents to make that more relevant for them? Okay, and just like we did for rigor, this is a verb list that I share with teachers sometimes that shows you where things will fall in that rigor relevance framework. Okay, remember that we're trying to land as much of our learning up here in what we call quad D. This is both rigorous and relevant, right? So when we're asking students to do things like justify or predict, conclude, recommend, okay, we're living in that quad D. And guys, if you don't take a screenshot of anything else, take a screenshot of this, right? Write some of these down so that you know what to be looking for. Again, you're going to see some things live here in quad A because we just have to, right? Sometimes we have to calculate or label or spell. But again, we're going to get very little impact out of those, and it's not going to engage our students near as much as if we move here to the right or we move up. and especially if we move over here to quad D, okay? So I'll just pause there for a second in case you need to take a picture of that, and I just see if anybody has any questions right now. Are we good? Okay. All right. And one more thing on the relevance. So I just want to point out that claims evidence reasoning model is a really good way to make things relevant for the students. Okay. We use this in our science programs, right? We can also use it with language arts. We look at making a claim. What do we know? Looking for the evidence. So how do we know that? And then supporting our evidence, or supporting with evidence our claim. All right. And then we get to that explanation. So again, this is going to put us into that quad D. Okay. Okay. So we've talked about making it rigorous. We've talked about making it relevant. We're going to talk now about making it matter. Here's what I mean by that. All right. When we make it matter, we're making it important to the students, right? Remember that when we were looking at what should we look for in our students to know that they're engaged in our lesson, this is that fourth one, meaning, right? They have to have meaning in it, okay? And so when we're thinking about what projects or activities we create for our students, all right, I want you to keep a few things in mind, all right? First, think about how we can have students create, okay? So again, I'm gonna refer back to some things that we have inside of our program. This is from our Into Literature program, and along with each one of our units in Into Literature, we have activities like this where we ask students to create something. In this case, it's a comic strip. We have one that's create a movie trailer, and I know that this stuff works, guys. I've got a 14-year-old who's really interested in movies. All right, wants to work on movies when he gets older. This would work really well for him, right? To take a book that we're working on reading, all right, and making that movie trailer out of it. So that would be more meaningful to a lot of students, right? To be able to create. I also want to bring this to science class really quickly. So this is a lab that we get out of Science Dimensions, okay? And I want you to just take a look at this lab. This is called the Beak Lab, all right? And you can see inside of here, we have a procedure. We have materials on the left-hand side. We've got an observation section at the bottom. And let's just read through the procedure real quick. We ask the students to make a plan to build a tool that will pick up and move different seeds. Record, draw, and design. Then select your materials and build your model. Then test it to find out what seeds it can move and record your data, and then analyze your results. Identify how the shape and structure of your tool affected how it worked. Okay, so we're working on some engineering principles here, right? We're looking at that engineering process, that engineering design process, where we make a plan, we build our plan, we test it, and then we analyze those results. And we could reiterate that process and go back through it. That's a lot different than in a science class where we have a lab like the paper chromatography lab. Look at the differences in the procedure here. Using a pencil, draw a line 1 centimeter from the bottom of the paper. On the line, use the marker, create a dot on the line, tells you how far. Put about 3 centimeters of water in the cup, suspend the end of the filter, allow the water to spread the ink upwards for at least 2 minutes. Look at the difference between these. Here I'm asking the students to create something. And in that process, look at all that they're learning, right? They're problem solving. They're learning about making a claim and finding evidence for my claim. Whereas in the paper chromatography lab, everybody's getting the same result, okay? Paper chromatography lab is really in quad A. The Beak lab moves a lot closer to quad D. It's a lot more relevant for our students. We're asking them to create something. Okay, so let's talk about the second part of that making it matter. To really make it matter to the students, right, we've got to personalize it. So how do we do that? One way that we can personalize is to put students inside of the experience. Okay. Now, you might be saying, well, that's hard to put students inside of the experience because we're on lockdown, right? We can't take kids places. One way you can do that is with this really great app that's called Google Expeditions. If you're not familiar with Google Expeditions, it's a free app. You can download it on your iPad, your iPhone, an Android device. You download it and you've got these really nice field trips and augmented reality. All right. And if you're not familiar with that is, I just encourage you to try this out. Okay. This is a really cool tool that you can use later today with your students, right? Now you see on here, we have HMH field trips powered by Google Expeditions inside of some of our programs, like into social studies and science dimensions. We do have lesson plans and specific connections to our programs that go along with Google Expeditions. But I'm going to tell you a secret, guys. You don't need the HMH field trips to use Google Expeditions. You can use it on a lot of different things. You can take field trips all over the world, okay? Can also be used in science class. There's this really nice augmented reality where we can see bones. We can see different types of bones. We swipe through those. We can explore and go around a 360-degree view of the bone. We can take it apart and look inside. Just some really neat activities that you can do inside of Google Expeditions, all right? That puts the students in the world of what's going on and the learning that we're trying to get them to do. I want to roll out something else. This is something that's called 20% time. And this is something that a lot of companies have engaged in, Google being one of them. If you notice that font and color scheme kind of follows Google. 20% time is this. There are some companies, and this is, by the way, based on the work of Daniel Pink and that book, Drive. And what they do is they take 20% of their employees' time, okay, and they let them really pursue passions that they have. By the way, this is where a lot of the projects that Google has done have come out of. Things like Google Maps, Google Forms, those have come out of the 20% time, where Google said to their employees, look, we're going to give you 1 out of every 5 days to work on your passion projects, okay? So whatever that is, you work on that and develop those and see what we get. And what they found is that because the employees had choice over what they were doing, they produced some really cool things, right? And so that's where I want to take you with us, personalizing it. Student choice is really important in order to make the learning more meaningful to them, okay? In order to make it personalized and something that they want to dive into. So when we talk about learner engagement, choice and voice, so voice meaning that they're able to express themselves in the way that they want to, are two super important ways to make that happen very quickly. Choice and voice, okay? And so for my third point under that make it matter, I just want to talk about guests and pros. Guys, we're working, a lot of us, in this virtual platform now, whether that be video calls or whatever it is. And it's a perfect opportunity to tap into having guests come onto those calls and work with your students. And pros, okay? Because, if you have students that are interested in biology, and again, I'll just use my own family as an example. I have a son that's interested. He wants to be a zookeeper someday. I have a connection, a friend that we graduated with who is a zookeeper. Okay, so I can make that connection and have her hop on a call with him, a video call, and he can learn more about what that looks like. You can do the same thing in your classrooms, right? Connect with people, connect with professionals that will interest your students. So again, that makes it more meaningful and it makes it matter for them because it's real world, right? Okay, so far we've talked about making it rigorous. We've talked about making it realistic, right? We've talked about making it matter. Let's talk about making it known. So here's what I mean by this one, okay? We need to do what Stephen Covey says in his 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. One of those habits is to begin with the end in mind. And if you remember, we talked about that at the very beginning of the presentation. I said, let's begin with the end in mind. Let's talk about what it will look like if my students are engaged. What does that look like? What am I trying to get out of them? They're attentive, right? We talked about them being attentive, persistent, having meaning to them, and they're committed to the project, right? We began with the end in mind. We knew what we were shooting for. Now let's talk about how we get there. Guys, we have to do the same thing with our students. We have to begin with the end in mind. So often, in my almost 20 years in education, I was a principal and a curriculum director for a number of years. I saw so many teachers start a lesson, teach the entire lesson, and never once did they talk about to the students what they wanted the students to learn. We have to tell the students what we want them to learn, and we'll find so much more success. So what does that look like? I really am a firm believer in learning targets. All right, so at the very beginning of the lesson, we tell the students what we're going to teach them. We tell them what that target is. When they know what they're shooting for, then they'll work harder to get there. That will make it more meaningful to them. All right. I don't know about you. I don't like getting in a car and riding with someone if I don't know where I'm going. Yet so often we do that with our students. We ask them to come to class. I'm going to teach you, you're going to learn, and then it'll all be over, right? If we really want them engaged and we want it to be meaningful for them, we should tell them where they're going. We should also help them with how they're going to get there, okay? I call that assessment capable learners. And there's a lot of really good research around this. Okay, so I know I've mentioned those of you that have been on the calls before. I've talked about John Hattie and his research around what works in classrooms. Okay, where he's taken all of these research studies and looked at what works and what doesn't, and what has positive effects and what doesn't have positive effects on student learning. Assessment capable learner is one of the most powerful classroom strategies that we can use. And there's really 3 steps to that. Okay, it's where am I now? So students knowing where they are now, and students knowing where they're going. Where am I going? That's that learning target. What am I shooting for? Okay, in a lot of classrooms, that looks like an I can statement. If you've heard of an I can statement, it's really just taking the learning objective or the standard and putting it into an I can student-friendly language, okay? So maybe it's we're working on 2-digit subtraction in 2nd grade, okay? So maybe it's I can subtract a 2-digit number from another 2-digit number, right? And then the 3rd piece of assessment capable learners is equipping students with how they can bridge the gap. So helping them develop those strategies inside of themselves, like persistence, but also like inside of math class, what are those specific strategies? How do we borrow, right? How do we approach problem solving, okay? So students need to know, where am I now? Where am I going? And how am I gonna bridge that gap in between, okay? What we find is that we need students who are resilient and are persistent, right? And they need to have that mindset of Thomas Edison, where, you know, it wasn't that he had failed, it was just that he had found 10,000 ways that didn't work, right? And then he came to the light bulb and he got it to work. And it's the same with our students, okay? So inside of that assessment capable learner, one of the things that I like to talk to teachers about is that we need to teach students that it's okay to fail. It's okay not to be successful or to get the right answer every time, okay? As long as they know what the target is, and as long as we equip them with those tools to get there, okay? Sometimes we're gonna struggle, and it's about building that persistence that we're looking for inside of our students, right? So remember that we were talking about, we wanna make it known. We begin with the end in mind, okay? A lesson where we've made it known for the students, a known lesson as I like to call it. What am I learning? Why am I learning it? And how will I learn it? Bridging that gap. How am I gonna get there, right? Okay, so we talked about how when we talk about how we engage our students, remember we need to make it rigorous and relevant, Okay, and that was that that quad A, B, C, and D learning, the rigor and relevance scale. And then we need to try to make it matter. How do we make it personal for the students? Okay. And then finally, we talked about assessment capable learners and making it known, beginning with the end in mind. Okay, guys, thank you again tonight for your time. We're done a little bit earlier than we normally are. I'll attribute that to Gabrielle was not on with us tonight, and he's just such a talker. So what questions do you guys have? Any thoughts, comments, anything you want to contribute? I'm not hearing anything. Ileana, did anything pop up in the chat box?
We do not have anything in the chat box.
Okay. Just want to make sure I can't see it from my screen. So
Yes, I believe all the attendees or all the invitees have been given your contact information. So should anyone have any additional questions that they can think of after the fact, please feel free to contact Jason.
please do. Yeah, I'm always happy to continue the conversation. Okay, guys. Awesome.
Okay.
Okay. Guys, next week we're talking about, oh, I just lost my notes here. I know what it is.
Will be about effective instruction, Jason.
Effective instructional practices. Thanks, Andres. Okay, guys, it's been a pleasure, and I look forward to seeing all of you next week, okay?
Thank you, Jason.
Okay, thanks a lot, Jason, for this interesting webinar and all the information you share with us. Please make sure you share your email on the chat box so we can send your certificate of participation. And well, we'll see you for the next event coming up next week, Wednesday, 27, same hour. Thanks for joining us and have a great day.
Thank you,
everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.